Welcome back to the Authlete channel. I'm Domingos Creado and this is the OAuth track. Today I'm going to talk about the most used grant type, which is the refresh token. When I present to you the general structure of the OAuth, I've told you that the authorization server must implement two endpoints. One is the authorization endpoint, another one is the token endpoint. The authorization endpoint allows the resource owner, the owner of the protected resource, to grant to the client the permissions to do it. And while the token endpoint allows the client to interact with the authorization server to pull the access token from it. When I was presenting you the authorization code flow description, I told you that grant types allow the segregation of customer interaction with the AS and what is client interaction with the authorization server. So during that video, I'm showing you this diagram. Shows you the relationship between the components. For this refresh token description, makes more sense to show you this diagram. That's exactly the same. I will walk you through this. This is a timeline description of the interaction between the same components. And the times go by from top to bottom, and the same components on the diagram before was showing now on the columns. So you see on the third column, there's a client, and that starts the authorization code flow by redirecting the browser to the authorization endpoint. And when the browser sends the request to authorization endpoint, it might send all the session cookies that are pre-established. So depending upon the permissions that are required and requirements on, for instance, the user authentication, the authorization endpoint starts engaging into a chattiness between the AS and the browser and the resource owner to collect the consentment. Once the owner of the resource has granted permissions, the authorization server creates the authorization code and redirect the browser back to the client using the redirect URL that I've shown you on the authorization code flows video. So the client now interacts with the token endpoint, sending the authorization code plus its credential if it has one. And the token endpoint then returns an access token, a refresh token, the list of the scopes that have been granted to the client, and the TTL, the time to live of the access token. And what is the semantics of the refresh token, right? So the refresh token represents and materializes the grant that has been created by the owner of the resource to the client. In other words, on the OAuth parlance, it's a grant type. It represents exactly the authorization code that was created by the resource owner to the client. So, and that allow it to be used as part of the token endpoint interaction between the client and the authorization server. Okay, going back to the sequence diagram or the timeline diagram that I'm showing you. So the first steps, the first 5 messages is the same as the authorization code flow, where the client redirects the browser of the owner of the resource to the authorization server. The authorization servers renders an authorization code, redirect the browser back to the client. The client receives that access token, access the token endpoint with a grant type equals to authorization code, and then it will get from the token endpoint, then access token, the refresh token, the list of the scopes, and the TTL. Then the client now can start accessing the resource server, the protected resource on the resource server. And after a certain time, the TTL, let's say the TTL, it's 5 minutes or something like that, the access token will become invalid. And then when the client tries to access the protected resource on the resource server, it will receive an error, like an invalid token, or an access denied. So based on that, the client will use the refresh token here, the grant type. So it's going to access the token endpoint, sending the grant type equals to refresh token, and the refresh token equals to the value that he got from the first request to the token endpoint. Then it's going to also provide, if the client has a credential, it's going to also send also the credential on it. The token endpoint will return a new access token, optionally, and a refresh token, and this list of the scopes, the new list of scopes that might match or not, right? And a new TTL. So if the refresh token is valid, right? So that's one option here. After that, client now has reestablished the access to the protected resource on the resource server, accessing it and getting an unprotected resource response. So here I'm showing you the block diagram that will tell you that the client, while interact with the token endpoint, it's transparent to the resource owner, which means that if you are a user interacting with a client that are accessing your protected resource on a domain, it's transparent to you that the client is extending its session in order to continue accessing the protected resource. So that's why I told you that probably the most used, you ain't gonna see it happening. So as the time goes by, it's expected and probably semantically logical for the permissions to be not getting narrowed, which means that when the authorization code was created, you get certain level of access, and after some time, the same permissions are getting decreased in order to prevent abuse of the API. As it's transparent to you, it's better for it to getting narrower and narrower, and probably until reach a point that the refresh token is not valid anymore, and the client cannot extend its session indefinitely, right? Another aspect of it is that the set of scopes might be different, right? So the permissions are out of it. It will be different. So it might be different. So mapping the concepts of it. So the access tokens used for the client to have access to certain protected resource throughout an API, while the refresh token is the mechanism for extending its access. In other words, it's extending the session with the access to the protected resource. And as it is an object that will be used exclusively for extending session, it only makes sense between the client and authorization server interaction. And two final notes on the refresh token grant is that the usage and the volume of calls and the workload that's pushes to authorization server is heavily dependent on the client itself. So you need to make sure that you're monitoring per client how they are using and how they're interacting with that. That creates a trade-off on the design while deploying it, make it available for clients, right? There's mechanism that we call when the token endpoint, when using the refresh token, responded to a different refresh token, we call it refresh token rotation. That allows the AES to not grant for a very longer period of time the access to the token endpoint. But the drawback of this is that it makes sure that it doesn't create, the clients will not create multiple thousands and millions of refresh tokens on the AES side. So I think that's it for the refresh token. For sure, the refresh token is one of the most fruitful grant type that you get deployed, and there's a design trade-off on it, and there's a educational part that you need to do it with the clients that are using it. But that grant type allows you to prevent very long living access token to exist, right? So the next videos that I'll go through this track is going to be to finish the original OAuth draft, and it's going to be on the client credential. There are two grant types that will probably not reach OAuth 2.1, but we should cover it. It's a resource owner as well as implicit flow. Then there will be additional video on the security, reviewing it, and then we're going after different specifications, more advanced ones. So I hope you're enjoying the series, and if you like it, subscribe to the channel and give the thumbs up. And also, if you want to hear a specific topic on OAuth, on the architecture of it or the trade-off of it, let me know. Drop us an email or let a comment on the YouTube, and we're glad to help you on that. See you. Thank you.